I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, eConsent for Research, Considerations in Implementation and IRB Review. We're excited to be discussing this topic with you today. I'm Ari Burgess, Quorum's Director of Client Relations. On that note, if you'd like to stay informed on Quorum initiatives, such as our webinars, be sure to sign up for our mailing list. You can find the mail list by going to our website, www.quorumreview.com, and clicking on the News and Events. You'll find the mail list sign up in the upper right-hand corner. This will ensure that you receive the latest e-news updates from Quorum, including Quorum's responses to FDA guidance, trends in clinical trial review, and our quarterly e-news publication, the Quorum Forum. I'll be giving you a brief overview of Quorum before introducing our presenter. And now I'd like to take a few moments before we get started to talk briefly about Quorum Review. Quorum Review is a fully accredited IRB with the Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, or AHRP, through 2014. Quorum is compliant with both FDA and OHRP requirements. We have 6 in-house licensed attorneys that provide both in-house regulatory guidance and can frequently be found speaking at industry events providing thought leadership. Quorum has boards that are appropriately comprised to review studies in the United States, Canada, and now even beyond North America. Currently, Quorum is one of the largest central IRBs with over 180 employees, and of those that are of equivalent size, we are the only IRB that remains independent of venture capital ownership. Quorum is proud of the number of employees that hold CIP certifications, Certified IRB Professional. Currently, 60% of our affiliated IRB members, 40% of our regulatory staff, and 20% of our study manager and support positions hold the CIP certification. Quorum's turnaround times are among the best in the industry. Quorum holds 15 convened board meetings each week. We have a meeting every day dedicated to the review of new protocols, 2 board meetings each week where we review North American studies. We have 1 meeting each week that has a depth in oncology expertise, if you'd prefer your oncology studies be reviewed there. Additionally, we have a staff of reviewers who are continuously reviewing expeditable items during business hours. The number of meetings we offer enables us to provide 24-hour turnaround time of site documents from the receipt of a completed submission to posting approval documents on the portal, 36-hour review cycle for amendments, and same-day site changes. To streamline site submissions, Quorum offers a one-time submittal of the CV and audit documentation. This prevents redundant submission. Among Quorum's founding principles was the customer experience, and to support that experience today, we have staff available from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And each study with Quorum, regardless of its size, will receive its own study manager. And again, I'll plug our legal team here because I think it's worth mentioning that many central IRBs utilize outside counsel, and the fact that Quorum doesn't means many things for our customers. We have a regulatory attorney at every board meeting to help navigate the complex laws and regulations. Attorneys help with our consent form development, and our attorneys help with answering complex questions regarding study and consent form design. Finally, it's because of Quorum's investment in our regulatory staff that we're able to put on these free webinars that help the research community at large. Additionally, Quorum offers a secure portal where you can find all of your approval documents. You'll find many different kinds of status reports in our Smart Form site information questionnaire. Quorum's aware that there are special needs for Phase 1 and research that qualifies for expedited review. And we have special teams and processes for these kinds of studies. We work with hospitals and institutions and are able to support their unique needs. To date, we have signed working agreements with over 800 institutions, and that number does not count the institutions that work with us but don't require a signed agreement. Additionally, Quorum has a staff of institution specialists whose primary function it is to assist universities and hospitals through the process of utilizing a central IRB when appropriate. This model has been very successful at getting a larger percentage of overall study sites utilizing a central than sponsors or CROs originally thought possible. We're aware that quality is supremely important for our customers, and we perform a 100% quality check on all documents. Finally, we wanted to make everyone aware of Quorum's commitment to efficiency. Quorum employs a number of black belts and other Six Sigma qualified personnel whose sole job it is to continuously evaluate our processes and to eliminate steps that don't add value, giving our customer a less complicated process with less steps and less opportunity for error. And now I'd like to introduce today's expert presenter, Claire Carberry. Claire Carberry joined Quorum Review IRB in September of 2009 as a regulatory attorney. Prior to joining Quorum Review's regulatory department, Ms. Carberry worked as a regulatory analyst and legal intern at Western IRB. Ms. Carberry received her Juris Doctorate from Seattle University in 2007 and was admitted to the Washington State Bar Association in the fall of 2007. In addition, Ms. Carberry is a member of the Health and Corporate Law sections of the WSBA. Ms. Carberry passed the Certified IRB Professional Exam and has held her CIP certification since 2010. She currently serves as a member of the Northwest Association for Biomedical Research, NWABR, and Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, PRIMER. And now I'll transition the slides to Claire.
Great. Thank you so much, Ari. And thank you to all of you that are attending today. This is a topic that we're hearing a lot of buzz about, but you might not have seen a lot of action yet. I think individuals and organizations like the idea of electronic consent, but there's a lot of questions and challenges, hurdles to overcome as far as actually implementing it in a study. Quorum has had the opportunity to review and approve electronic consent in some studies so far, and we've developed processes and policies around this, and this presentation today is intended to give some insight into some of the challenges that we as an IRB face that I think would be also faced by other types of organizations. So I'm going to be going through, I'll give a brief introduction to eConsent and try to define what we mean when we're talking about eConsent. And then I'm going to talk specifically about some of the things that an IRB has to think about when they're reviewing research and how electronic consent impacts that. And so you'll see probably some parallels between some of the things an IRB has to think about, like privacy, confidentiality, documentation, that would be the same for a sponsor, or CRO, or a site. As I mentioned, the first thing before I dive into the regulations is I want to try to kind of get us on the same page, get a little bit of an understanding of what we mean when we say eConsent and what's out there, what we have seen so far and heard about so far. So I think the first things to think about when you're having a conversation about electronic consent, perhaps you're talking with a vendor that may be involved with a particular study, are these two questions here. First is, where and how is the system used? How do people interact with it? Is it used only at the site? Would it be used online? Is it web-based and so people could access it from any type of device? How do people log into it? Those questions relate certainly to confidentiality and the security of the system. What do people see when they are utilizing this? And then another important question is, what is needed to run the system? We've seen at Quorum and heard about at Quorum, a variety of different things, and I'll go to the next slide here, that sort of range in complexity. So the first, and this is a continuum here, going from really simple on the left to much more complex here on the right. So, one of the things that we've seen is just taking the paper document that has been approved by the IRB, putting it into Adobe or some other type of software product that allows people to sign it electronically. So it doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, but it does have the nice feature of being able to sign electronically, perhaps remotely from a home computer potentially, and then you have a pretty reliable, assuming the software is a legitimate software, you have a reliable time and date stamp, so there's not a lot of question about when documents were signed. Then we've seen things that are online and tablet-based that take the content of the paper version and maybe jazz it up a little bit. The interface is a little bit nicer probably than flipping through a paper document. Maybe there's images included. Some of these, as we're moving to the right here, there's more interactive features, so there could be participant education pieces. Maybe there's the basic information that's communicated via text, but then there's a little video that's embedded for people that want to know more about the concept of placebo or the randomization schedule or other concepts that are discussed throughout the consent. There might be quizzes and feedback to test knowledge before participants are allowed to move to the next section. And then, there's also this piece that's certainly of advantage, but not as much of a concern or use to the IRB that we've seen, where this might interface with other things that sponsors and CROs are required to keep track of as part of a study. So AE monitoring, tracking of participants, so sort of back office things that are useful for the site and monitors potentially to look at how the study is being conducted, how enrollment is happening and whatnot. So there's lots of features potentially depending on the type of product that you'd be working with. So one of the things that we've, in our work with some vendors that have been used for electronic consent, Quorum has kind of thought about, well, what types of things do we want to know about a vendor? And this is sort of tweaked somewhat so that it's, for a sponsor or CRO, if they're thinking about working with a particular eConsent vendor, these are some questions I think that are valuable, and the answers may lead to further questions, but to get you started with trying to understand what they're proposing, what their product does, what type of experience they have, the IRBs that they've worked with. One thing that is certainly important, especially for a more interactive product that would require people to log in and know how to use the system, is what type of training is available and how will people be trained? Is that part of a package that they're selling to you? I'll talk a little bit about 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, but that's an important thing to be thinking about. How many studies has it been used in? Are they FDA-regulated clinical trials? Have they had any feedback from the FDA about their product? That, of course, would be something you'd like to see. And then how is system access controlled? So some of the systems that we've seen, often it's a username and password, but maybe that there's also an app that needs to be downloaded, and so there might be some complexities there that it's good to have the vendor walk you through how people will get access, both site employees, sponsor CRO employees, and then also the participants themselves. And then certainly if you're doing things electronically and you're not going to have a paper version that's actually signed with a wet signature, you want to know about the backup process, what types of systems do they have in place, and probably have that evaluated by someone with technical expertise to tell you whether it's sufficient given the importance of the documents that are being generated and stored by this product. So I want to move now into IRB review of eConsent, just to give you some insight into some of the challenges that we faced, how this sort of interacts with the IRB review. It's important whether you would use Quorum or any other IRB for a study that involves eConsent to think about what the IRB is going to need to see and the steps that they need to take and what they're required to do by regulation. So the first hurdle that we faced, and one of the most obvious requirements when you're talking about consent forms and the consent process, is this documentation of consent. The regulations have this statement, and I've tried to include citations. I'll just note at the bottom of the slide here whenever I'm referring to the regulations. So for those of you that are inclined, you can do a little more looking at that. But so the first regulatory requirement here is that an IRB shall require documentation of informed consent. And that generally interpreted as a signature. Both the FDA and HHS require this documentation. And there are some exceptions, but for purposes today, we're going to be talking about a trial that would require an actual signature from an individual and not go down that road of when the IRB might be waiving this requirement. The first thing that comes up, or the next thing that comes up, I guess I should say, when you're looking at regulatory requirements related to signatures is, of course, 21 CFR Part 11, or as it's affectionately referred to, just Part 11. And this is an FDA regulation. It applies to electronic records that are required under FDA regulations. And so if you remember, I was just talking about the fact that documentation of consent is something that's required under FDA regulations. So an eConsent system that is being used to make that documentation of consent should be Part 11 compliant. This is something that you should be asking your electronic consent vendor about when you're looking at particular products, whether Part 11 compliance is something that they can claim. Just to give you a little bit more information for those of you that may not as familiar with Part 11, I want to touch on just a few aspects. So when a document meets certain criteria that are set out under Part 11, the FDA actually considers these electronic records to be the equivalent of a paper record and a handwritten signature that's executed on paper. So that's why that Part 11 compliance is important, because without that, it may not be considered the equivalent to that paper record, that paper consent form. There are certain technical requirements that need to be in place when you have a system that you're claiming is Part 11 compliant. And there's also administrative controls that need to be put in place. So it's the system itself has to have technical aspects, but the users of the system have to have procedures that they're following in their interaction with the system in order for the entire use of it to be considered compliant with Part 11. A couple of the technical things that need to be in place is the signature needs to be unique to just one individual, so you can't have a username and password and signature that everyone at the site uses. That may be different than maybe how they're using other electronic systems that they have, so that's important to keep in mind. The organization that's utilizing this actually has to verify the identity of the individual before an electronic signature may be utilized. And there's ways to do that that are well known, but again, this is where it's important maybe to have someone with the technical expertise from an IT group help you in evaluating a particular product. And then also, as part of Part 11 compliance, certification actually has to be provided to FDA communicating that it's the intent that this use of electronic signatures with this system is intended to be the equivalent, the legally binding equivalent of a handwritten signature. A couple of other technical things that I think are important to think about, and hopefully this slide would be a good thing to refer back to if you're evaluating a particular system, is you have to maintain unique ID codes and passwords. There needs to be checking of codes and passwords that's periodic, that's occurring. There needs to be loss management procedures to deauthorize passwords that are somehow compromised. Transaction safeguards, preventing the unauthorized use of passwords, so that's both a technical and an administrative process-based thing. And then also the testing of any device that's going to generate your ID code or password information. The next thing I wanted to cover is the obligation of an IRB surrounding subject privacy and confidentiality of data. So the next regulatory requirement here is that the IRB must determine that there are adequate provisions to protect privacy of subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of data. And this is somewhat broad. There's not a lot of direction that is necessarily given to IRBs about how to make sure that this is true. In the paper world, evaluating privacy and confidentiality, we focus a lot on the site and what types of procedures or processes they have in place at the site to prevent access. And usually, if it's even if they're using some sort of electronic system in addition to paper, we ask questions like, are computers password protected, and who has access to these computers or the file room? And Quorum has on our site information questionnaire a handful of questions about this. But it becomes more concerning when we're talking about electronic consent. And I think even just having records electronically that are transferred back and forth, these are the types of questions here on this slide that we felt when we were evaluating, well, what do we need to know about an electronic consent system to feel like we have enough information to actually evaluate whether privacy and confidentiality are adequately protected. It's a more robust set of questions than I think we've asked in the past. So again, one is Part 11 compliance is a big one. The type of hardware and the platform that's going to be used. So some of these systems are, and the next question is whether it's web-based or app-based or somehow how is it delivered. But some of them may be only on an app, and others may be web-based. And so we want to have an understanding of both. Is it device agnostic, meaning that it could be used on any type of device, or is it specific to Apple product? And then the other thing that's important, I think, is the site computers. We can get some sort of assurances about what types of protections are in place. But if people are accessing this from home, do they have to have a certain type of virus protection, or and it's a rabbit hole that you could go pretty far down. And so we want to try to be reasonable in the questions that we're asking, but also make sure that people aren't being asked to do something or provide a lot of information through something that really isn't secure. If something is web-based, we ask what type of encryption is used. We ask questions about whether We'd like to know if the electronic consent that's being proposed, if the product would somehow interface with an existing electronic health record system. Is it going to be pulling information from that? How users get access again. And then one thing that we've come across that was sort of interesting is whether the technology uses a location or other tracking feature. This is maybe something that you've seen in various different apps on your smartphone. It'll ask, this company wants to track your location. And we've come across that with a particular product where ultimately the IRB thought it wasn't really relevant to the use of this product in this context and that needed to be removed. But those are the types of things that we ask. You'll see some of these are pretty technical questions. And so one of the things that we've actually built into our process here at Quorum is that we can call on our IT department to help us analyze and understand the answers that we get to these questions. So like the type of encryption, I myself don't really have an IT background, and so the answer that I get, I may not be able to evaluate, is that type of encryption reasonable, given the type of information that is going back and forth here. And so we would pull someone from our IT department in to help us with that. And they can even potentially attend the board meeting where this would be reviewed to assist the board in understanding the technology and whether the protections in place are appropriate. Okay, so the next thing that we had to deal with when we were looking at electronic consent, and that was different when we're looking at an electronic consent versus paper, is the documentation of our review and our approval. So the IRB, again, we've got some regulatory requirements here that we have to uphold. We're required to prepare and maintain adequate documentation of all of our activities, and that includes copies of all approved sample consent documents. And then we also have to notify investigators, and as you know, we notify sponsors and CROs as well in writing of all of our decisions related to research, so whether we're approving the proposed activity or not, and what more information we may need. All of that is communicated in writing. In the paper world, what we do with consent forms specifically is we stamp them. We apply a stamp and it says approved, and that's the document that can be used, and the sites make copies of the form that's approved for their site, and it's all very paper focused. One of the challenges that we had to figure out and have had to figure out as we encounter different technologies each time we actually touch base with our IT group, and just to make sure that we're coming up with a way to fully document our review and our approval given that particular technology. If there's multimedia or audio or video components, we've had to be a little bit creative with how we adequately document what we've reviewed. That's something that we've been able to reach out to the electronic consent vendors and say, okay, we need access to this document, but we also need a way to archive the consent presentation in its full, with the audio that's over the top, the audio track, any of the video that's included, any of the pop-ups, so that we can refer back to it down the line if we need to pull that up for any reason. There's different ways to do this, and we're comfortable with, that we have adequate documentation. I would ultimately like to have something that's just a single file that shows us everything, but we've had to be creative with some of the products we've seen. So we used a combination of screenshots, and like I said, when you've got an electronic consent that maybe shows a screen and then there is a word that you can click on, and if you click on that word, a box opens with the definition, and then maybe there's multiple words on the screen that do that. It may require 3 screenshots of the same page in order to really capture all the text and all the information that was reviewed that would be presented to a potential subject. Another option for these more interactive presentations, we actually have a reviewer go through, just as a subject would, through the consent and pop open any of those terms that might have a definition attached, open any videos and play them. And so there is a way, there's probably multiple ways actually, to capture a video file that looks at that from beginning to end. But that's something to think about as far as documentation on your side of things, to ensure that what the IRB reviewed and approved is also what you're working with and delivering to people. If it's a web-based system, archiving of web pages is also an option. So there's probably other technical solutions, but those are just examples of things that we've done to try to make sure that we have appropriate documentation. certainly more challenging at this point in time than with a paper process. One of the things that I have a note for myself here that I wanted to mention is that if you're looking at doing an electronic consent using a particular vendor, a particular product for a specific study, and you're in the early phases of talking about how that would be implemented, you think you might use Quorum as the IRB, call us. We would love to have a conversation about it. These are the kinds of things that are really helpful to think through as far in advance as possible on your end and on our end to help make the process go smoother when you're actually ready to roll out the study and roll out the consent. And this is actually kind of covers what I just was talking about, the difference between the paper and electronic versions and how we document that. Okay, so the next issue that we as an IRB have to consider is the consent process. And there's an FDA guidance document called the Guide to Informed Consent that has a nice statement here that the informed consent process is more than just a signature, and it's a process of information exchange. And everybody that's involved in research, the sponsors, CROs, IRB, investigator, we all share responsibility for making sure that that process is adequate and that the document should be the basis for a meaningful exchange between the investigator or their staff and the subject. I think one of the things that gets people excited about electronic consent, especially these more interactive products, is that it does engage people differently and arguably in a better way. People generally don't review 30-page documents in their work or their outside of work except in really unique circumstances. It's not something that we do on a daily basis. It's extremely intimidating. If you've seen some of the electronic consent products that are out there, they really try to make the information more accessible. And I think that that's the thing that is getting people really interested in this as an option, that you can communicate things and really have people understand what you're asking them to do, what their obligations are, and what they might get out of it in a much easier way, in a much easier format. And so that's a way that the electronic consent process can get us closer to making sure that the consent process itself really is adequate. This guidance also lists out a few things that the IRB needs to be aware of, and this is whether it's paper or electronic. We need to know who's going to be conducting the consent interview, whether that's staff or the PI, or in unique circumstances it might be someone different. We would need to know that and find that to be appropriate. The timing of obtaining informed consent, and then if there's a waiting period. FDA and probably all of us in IRB land are always really concerned about people being rushed into making a decision, and in certain situations for certain types of studies where maybe people have an acute issue, that is something we pay a lot of attention to. The amount of time that individuals are given to consider participation relates to that, and then any other additional agreements that they are asked to sign is something that we're supposed to be aware of. So something that I mentioned earlier, that location tracking or terms of use, it's good to ask about those. Ask the vendor that you might be looking at using, or think about when you're looking through the product if you see anything that's akin to a terms of use, because those need to be provided to the IRB, and the IRB may not find that type of agreement to be appropriate in this context. And so if it's something that really needs to be in there from the perspective of this vendor, then it's important to maybe come up with some justifications for why that needs to be there. When you're looking at the regulations as far as the consent process, there is a requirement for investigators that they need to seek consent only under circumstances that provide the individual or their representative the opportunity to consider whether or not to participate. So again, going back to where people might be feeling rushed or pressured to join a particular study, that's something that's concerning and that the regulations speak directly to. And then one other thing here that I think certainly comes up a fair amount for IRBs when we're looking at informed consent is this, and again, a regulatory requirement that informed consent should not include any exculpatory language, and that's language that the individual who's signing the consent document is either waiving or appearing to waive any of the subject's legal rights, or language that releases or appears to release the investigator, the sponsor, the institution, or any of its agents from liability for negligence. So this can come up again in the electronic systems because you'll see things like terms of use potentially. Not so much that it comes up more in an electronic consent process otherwise than a paper process, but as part of the process it's important to keep that particular requirement in mind. One other thing that comes up as far as the consent process is this issue of a copy of the consent form being provided to subjects. And this is a question that we get a lot anytime we're having conversations with people about electronic consent. I get this question every time I've presented on electronic consent. How do you give participants a copy? Because you're required to do that. You're required to give a copy, not necessarily a signed copy, though that the practice, and ICH does require a signed and dated copy to be provided to individuals. And that's certainly the practice that people tend to follow. So all of the electronic consent systems that I've seen allow people to print, typically to a PDF or off of a printer, right? Anytime you can print something. And so that's not really an issue. It's after the individual has signed it. Typically they're signing using a stylus or their finger on a tablet, or there may be affixing an actual electronic signature if they're using a tower. It really depends on the product. But then once that's done and once that document is locked down, it can be printed for the individual and provided to them. So that's not necessarily a big hurdle as far as electronic consent, but I like to mention it because it's something that people are concerned about when they're thinking about the consent process. It's not necessarily intuitive that that's an option. So if we're thinking about complying with the consent process requirements, one of the things that comes up with electronic consent, and we're going back to these things that I've talked about earlier, who will be obtaining consent? Well, we've seen electronic consent used. There's more flexibility potentially, right? So we've seen a study where individuals would be visiting patients in their home, participants in their home, and they're asking maybe they're already part of a study and they're asking them to provide their samples for future research or something like that. Instead of carrying around a stack of consent forms, they're able to present that to individuals using a tablet that the individual who's making that visit has. Those are the kinds of things, again, we want to think about someone being provided a tablet rather than a paper document that they can keep, and think about, are they feeling rushed? They're in their home. Maybe they don't really want this person there. So we like to have some information, particularly in those types of more unique consenting situations, about what the proposal is for how consent will be obtained. What is the involvement of the PI is another question that we're supposed to be asking, and maybe they're not really involved because you do have people that are remote and getting consent remotely. The nice thing that I've seen, I think, with some of the more involved electronic consent that have that back office offerings that I was talking about, is that the PI can remotely even see what's happening with people in probably an easier way. It's all in one place than with a paper process. And so they can log in at the end of the day and see how many people have been consented and see the actual consent forms and, review some information about the person that was screened to make sure that that was appropriate. And so I think the PI's oversight is potentially made much easier with some of these products, of the PI's oversight of the consent process at least. Where will the consenting take place? I've kind of already covered that. And then again, the terms of use, and then how will copies be provided. One option when you have an electronic version, you don't have to scan it, would be potentially to give people an electronic copy also via email or in some other way. Maybe they can log into a portal system through the web and download it themselves when they get home. They have to be provided with a copy, not necessarily a paper copy. Again, I think it's best practice to give people that in hand unless you're pretty sure that they would have access to be able to get to that document electronically. But if you do both, that's a nice way for them to be able to get a hold of that document later, because chances are they may not be holding on tight to that paper copy, or they may lose a page or something. So that's a nice thing for them to refer back to. Another thing that is potential through some of these systems, I haven't seen this this specifically as an offering, but if you do have an interactive presentation that people can go through, and it can be sort of tailored because they're clicking on particular terms or things, they could potentially log back in later and look at those things again. Potentially even within the consent document itself, there might be downloads or things. So say you click on the schedule of visits, and that in and of itself is a document that can be printed. That's one page that would be easy for people to put on their bulletin board or calendar at home, so they remember when they need to be taking a particular medication or going in for a visit. So all of these things, I think it can be used in a lot of ways to make the process, the consent process more understandable and the participation itself easier potentially for subjects. One of the other things that comes up and is a little bit different potentially with electronic consent is this requirement of communicating, they call it significant new findings that are developed during the course of the research, which could relate to the participant's willingness to continue participating. That needs to be provided to the subject. All FDA, HHS, and ICH all require that type of information be communicated to people. You're probably very familiar with this. Anytime you have an amendment and a consent form change, individuals need to be reconsented. I think the electronic process is really interesting, especially if you're talking about something that's web-based that people could access remotely and off-site. There's some flexibility there. However, if you're using an electronic consent that requires a lot of development and coding on the back end, and it's information that needs to be communicated immediately to people or at their next visit, which is coming up next week, maybe it is more simple to approach it in a sort of hybrid way. So the initial process was electronic, but subsequent communications or consent documents are paper-based. And so it's important to keep in mind that there needs to be flexibility there, and you ultimately, the IRB can dictate how that information is delivered and when that information is delivered if they feel that it needs to be communicated immediately. And so you may be subject to those requirements one way or the other. Potentially an electronic consent can deliver that content faster, assuming that the development work wouldn't take a lot of time. But that's certainly another question that may be important to discuss with your eConsent vendor when you're looking at this is, how do you deal with amendments? How would people be reconsented? What would that look like? Show that to me. That's pretty much all I had for today. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is new. There may be IRBs that haven't seen this before, particularly if you're working with institutions that don't use a central IRB. This is going to be foreign to them. As was mentioned earlier and will be mentioned again, we have this list of questions to go over with an electronic consent vendor. I think that can assist even a local IRB with the process. These slides maybe could be a point of reference for you to help, if you're trying to work with an IRB that has a lot of questions or concerns about using electronic consent. I would highly, highly recommend, just getting in touch with the IRB or IRBs that you might be working with on a project that involves electronic consent because it is so new. Quorum is more than happy to set up a time to talk with you if you're thinking about it for a study. I've been on several of those calls. I really enjoy hearing about the technology, seeing more about these processes, so I'm happy to jump on those calls. I enjoy those and really like to try to think through logistically, process-wise, how will this impact your study? What kinds of things do you need to think about before you're ready to rock and roll with your study? That is the end of my presentation today, so I'm going to turn it back over to Ari.
I want to thank Claire for preparing and presenting the information that you got to view today on this topic that is very current. We'd like to let you know again that if you have additional questions, there is an opportunity to submit those at the end of the webinar. Your browser, if you leave your browser open once the webinar is closed, then the survey will pop up. Alternatively, you can email your questions to clientrelations@quorumreview.com, and we'll be getting back to you individually and answer your questions within 30 days. I want to remind you that the webinar recording, the slide deck, certificate of attendance, and special resource document that Claire talked about will all be posted on our website. We'll also be circulating an email that will let you know that that information is available, and the certificate of attendance will come via email. We do value your opinion, so again, another plug to please take the survey at the end and let us know what we can do to provide you with information that's relevant to you. And once again, we here at Quorum Review thank you for attending our webinar, and we hope you found this information useful and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.